heard of some schools maybe promoting their own version of homeschooling. You know, I suppose that's sort of an extension of what we're talking about. Have you heard of some schools coming up with their own package, given that you know, a lot of students are unable to leave home? Is that something that's going to be an opportunity for some schools to offer?
Yeah. Before this COVID-19, homeschooling is an alternative, and for some parents, they feel that they can take care of the education of their children at a very young age, and before they are allowed to go into formal education in the educational institutions, but only a very small portion or population of students and families are into that. But a lot of the parents now are asking for that, and because of that, it somehow also evolved. It's now being there's some policies being looked into before parents can go into homeschooling, which for me also defeats the homeschooling if the government would be regulating that, because you know, education is the primary responsibility of the parents. Let's not forget that it is merely delegated to the government. So that homeschooling, that should remain as an option, actually, with COVID or no COVID. But that is also now being looked into. But if we're looking at a participation of the educational institutions, then it's not really strictly homeschooling. If the school will be developing the learner materials, they would be participating with the parents, and the parents will facilitate the learning at home, but they would not be able to do it without the help of the school. Then that's different. It's not really strictly homeschooling, but it falls under the flexible learning options.
Right. So, and related to that also, I was reading last week that the public school system, I think less than half of them, but if I remember correctly, around 44 or 45% are ready for some digital mode of learning. What is the state of readiness for private schools? The general impression, of course, is that because private schools have more resources, that they are more equipped, they're more connected. But is that the case, the actual case?
Well, only around 60% of the schools, based on their
Private
own
schools.
survey of their own communities also. But this was done around April, so I think it would increase because of the preparations that are being made underway.
And of course, there are costs. I mean, so for the other 40% who need that infrastructure now because of the health crisis, has there been a COCOPEA appeal or representation and maybe government assistance to equip? I'm not even sure if that's possible, because I suppose that depends on the location of the school, whether the town itself or the province is connected and has electricity and all of that stuff.
Yeah, COCOPEA is in dialogue with various levels of the government in terms of capabilities of the students to go into online, and also for their connectivity needs. So with IATF, we had this presentation, and we asked at least for government to mediate or intervene with the private telecoms companies to provide free access to internet or reduced rates, so that we can offer this to the students, or even provide for mobile data packages, budget for laptops, gadgets, and other equipment. So we're asking for these things. And actually, there's a law. We have two important legislation that's already in place, and we just have to implement this in a wider scale. First is the Public Internet Act. I think this was 2 years ago, which requires putting in place connectivities in public areas. And we also have the Open Distance Learning Act, which actually provides subsidy for students and even teachers for equipment, laptops, and gadgets. So we're talking to the executive through the IATF and also to some legislators to sponsor a bill on this matter.
And what was the reaction of the IATF and the legislatures that you talked to? What did they say to you? Did they commit anything?
Well, they agree to our position, but again, the major problem remains the budget,
Funding. Yeah.
the funding. So I think the Congress is looking at some funds from last year to realign to the critically affected sectors, including education.
Right. And speaking of funding, a number of Filipino students, both in basic ed and in colleges and universities, they receive a subsidy through a voucher. Is that going to continue in the academic year, given that um, students will stay home? I know some of the subsidies were for other things besides tuition, such as transportation and cost of textbooks and other learning materials. Any word from the government about whether or not those will continue under this distance learning arrangement that we're adopting in the meantime?
Yeah, actually now the budget for the all of these government subsidies shall continue, but um, some were delayed. Releases were delayed due for last academic year because we also learned that these budgets were initially targeted for realignment during the first ECQ, but we were assured also that that this will continue for the students at least for settling their accounts for last academic year. But for this coming school year, we're hoping for the best. And not only for continuing the government subsidies, but we're also looking into expanding these subsidies to other students who are not initially grantees, but nonetheless are economically affected
Hmm.
by the ECQ. So um, there's a specific bill now. This is the PESA bill in Congress at the lower house. This is now under the Committee on Economic Affairs, chaired by Congresswoman Sharon Garin, on the bills authored by Congressman Salceda and Congressman Stella Kimbo. And they're actually now, probably as we speak, this is being approved at the second reading at the plenary of Congress. So in that economic stimulus bill, we were able to have these authors include the expansion of the various government subsidies. So for tertiary education subsidy, this is for higher education, we're looking at additional 18 billion budget to increase the slots to cover the 1.7 million higher education students who were not initially included as grantees last year, and also expansion of the ESC, senior high school vouchers in basic education. Again, to those who were not included but nonetheless are economically adversely affected, so around 15 billion. So hopefully this will be approved before Congress adjourns, and so that the Senate can also take this up and approve a similar economic stimulus bill. We're also working with senators like Senator Recto, Senator Angara, Senator Win Gatchalian. They also support similar expansion of government subsidies for students.
And what are the challenges in getting those measures passed? What have been some of the concerns you've been hearing or the opposition that you've been hearing?
The usual clarifications would be, um, of course, the no increase in tuition, and making sure that these subsidies will go directly to the needs of the students for their payment of tuition, and also for the benefit of the school personnel. And those are the usual. And of course, I think the major challenge would be funding again, because
Mm.
you have also other critically affected sectors who are also now asking for government support to help them also get back
Yeah,
into operations.
when you speak about funding and the budget in the Philippines, there's a provision in our constitution that says that the education sector should get the highest share of the national budget. But why should the private sector benefit from that? Why should it not be just limited to the public school system?
Yeah, the education is a public good. It is a public service. We are very consistent in advocating for that. So whether it is delivered under the public school system or the private education system, education remains to be a public good, and it deserves government funding. And by the way, when we talking about funding, we are able to our government is able to comply with that constitutional requirement that education should have the highest uh, budgetary provision,
Allocation.
no,
Yeah.
in the allocation in the General Appropriations Act. But now comparing our spending and allocation for COVID related expenses, in the I was looking at this in the internet. We're actually sixth in the ASEAN in terms of spending on COVID related matters. So we're lagging behind. We're only up from Timor Leste,
Oh wow.
Cambodia in terms of spending. So I think we have to do better in that respect.
Mm. Yeah, the Constitution also mentions the private sector playing a complementary role. What is that about?
Yeah, there's this constitutional provision that recognizes the complementary role of the public and the private educational institutions. And so, because of that, we are given this mandate of reasonable regulation and academic freedom. But this complementary role of private education, I think this has yet to be fully operationalized, because this means that private education, being given that role, should be able to thrive in whatever circumstances we have in the country. It should be able to thrive and should be able to provide the distinct brand of its education, and also to complement the efforts of the government in the aspect of delivery of education where public education is limited.
Hmm. Yeah, I know what you mean, but some people seem to have a different view of that, especially as you mentioned when you talk about tuition increases. I know from personal experience that it's expensive to run a school, and in fact, our school is among those that are struggling. But uh, there seems to be a perception that when you think about private schools, that they're all like LaSalle's or like Ateneos or USTs, but vast majority of private schools are actually um, are struggling even before the pandemic.
Yeah, the government actually saves a lot of money when it even when it supports or funds private education, because again private education complements that education service. We have 27 million learners in basic education and the 4 million in higher education. I don't think the government schools would be able to accommodate all of these students without the private education sector. In basic education, the private education institutions account to 16% of the entire enrollment in the country. That's around 4 million students. But in higher education, the private higher education sector accounts to 55% of the total enrollment.
Hmm.
So you can just imagine, even when the government spends for student subsidy for students to enroll in the private schools, it actually saves on costs of putting up more classrooms, constructing more facilities, even training of teachers. So I think this is where one aspect of complementarity comes in. in terms of funding. But of course, policy also, providing a level playing field, making sure that we have academic freedom for higher education institutions and basic education are also given some latitude in terms of coming up with their school policies. So all of these come together and they are under that complementarity principle under the Constitution.
So you're saying the private sector can be more efficient or does it more efficiently in according to, at least you said, your studies.
Yes, definitely. And then actually what we're thinking is that the private education should be given more roles in terms of providing quality education, because the private education is more advanced in terms of innovation, creativity, and also in terms of quality. And that is an aspect where the public education system could really benefit. So in some countries, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but wearing your hat as a lawyer, how do you answer the critics who say that they have problems with government subsidizing private businesses because that's what they say private schools are, without, of course, adding that many of them are not for profit or religious foundations. But what does the law say about government helping out private institutions?
Yeah, actually, contrary to this popular assumption that there's a constitutional prescription on funding of a private entity, that government money shall be used only for public purposes. This is actually a COA. This is an audit. This is a provision in the audit law, on the audit law of the Philippines, not in the Constitution. That's the first thing. And the second of all, even if you have that provision, education satisfies that public element, because again, education is a public good, whether it is offered in public or private education institutions. And I think we also have enough regulations in place to make sure that education delivered in the private sector is not abused and not reduced to a business, because running a school is not really a business. 70% is required by law. 70% of the tuition is required by law to be allocated to school personnel. 20% up to 30% should be used for facilities and other needs of the school. So there's very low margin for profit or return of investment. So if you're really into education, if you really want to profit, I don't think you'll go into education. It should be more than that.